Racist cop restrains black woman, but she authored the sanctions designed to dismantle officers like him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. The afternoon air carried the dry stillness of a government plaza. A place where flags barely moved and voices lowered themselves without being asked. And in the center of it stood Naomi Ellis. Composed and deliberate, her posture steady as if the moment had been rehearsed long before it ever arrived. She did not look around for approval. And she did not search the faces nearby for sympathy. Because she understood something most people never did. That authority did not always announce itself loudly and power did not always wear a uniform. Officer Daniel Crawford, on the other hand, believed power was visible, tangible, and immediate. Something that came from standing closer to the center line than everyone else and speaking with a tone that discouraged questions. He saw Naomi the way he had been trained to see disruptions. As problems to be managed, not people to be understood. And he acted accordingly, confident that the process would support him the way it always had. Naomi listened without interruption as words were spoken around her. Procedural phrases delivered with practiced certainty. And she noticed how quickly assumptions filled the gaps where curiosity should have been. She had seen this dynamic from conference rooms and committee hearings. From pages of reports and carefully drafted language. And she recognized the pattern immediately. The way momentum favored the loudest voice until something stronger redirected it. What separated Naomi from the others present was not defiance or outrage but preparation. The quiet assurance of someone who knew how systems actually changed. Not through spectacle, but through ink, signatures, and clauses that looked harmless until they were enforced. Her career had been built on identifying failures that hid behind routine. On tracing consequences back to decisions that no one wanted to revisit. And on designing standards that could not be bent by familiarity or ignored by habit. As the moments stretched, those nearby mistook her calm for compliance. Unaware that the calm was simply patience. The kind that comes from knowing time is an ally when the structure is sound. Daniel, certain the situation would resolve the way it always did, focused on maintaining control of appearances. Not realizing that appearances were the least durable part of any institution. Naomi's eyes lifted briefly. Not in challenge, but in recognition, as if she were noting a data point that confirmed a conclusion she had already reached. Somewhere beyond the plaza, in offices with sealed doors and schedules booked months in advance, documents existed that bore her language. Frameworks designed to evaluate conduct with clarity and consequence. Standards meant to protect the integrity of the badge by confronting those who misused it. Those measures had been written for moments exactly like this. Not to punish in anger, but to correct with precision. The irony was not lost on her, though she did not acknowledge it outwardly. Because irony was unnecessary when the truth was sufficient. As the scene continued, the balance began to shift in ways too subtle to notice at first. A glance exchanged. A hesitation introduced. A realization forming that the narrative was incomplete. Naomi remained centered, trusting the architecture she had helped build. Understanding that real accountability does not rush and does not shout. It arrives methodically, guided by rules that cannot be talked out of existence. And as the plaza held its breath, the story moved quietly toward its turning point. Not through confrontation, but through the inevitable activation of a system designed to recognize exactly who had crossed the line and why. The presence of authority lingered even after the initial tension softened. settling into the space like humidity before a storm. Subtle but unmistakable. And Naomi Ellis felt it in the way conversations shifted just a half step away from certainty. The plaza no longer felt neutral. Because moments like these never remained isolated. They echoed into offices and inboxes. Into quiet phone calls and internal messages that traveled faster than any raised voice. Officer Daniel Crawford sensed the change without understanding it. A faint disruption in the rhythm he trusted. The kind that unsettled him precisely because he could not point to its source. He adjusted his stance, maintaining composure, reminding himself that procedure was on his side, that order favored those who enforced it confidently. Naomi remained still, her attention focused inward rather than on the movement around her, recalling long hours spent in windowless rooms where decisions were made with careful language and measured intent. She had learned early that accountability was not dramatic. It was deliberate, built layer by layer so that when it arrived, it could not be argued away. Her work had required patience. The kind that accepted resistance as part of the process and silence as a signal rather than a weakness. The environment around them continued its routine. Footsteps passing. Distant traffic humming along at 35 miles per hour. The everyday world unaware that it was brushing against a fault line created by assumptions. Colliding with preparation. Daniel glanced toward his radio. Then away, trusting that nothing unusual would come through. Because nothing ever had before. And he believed familiarity equaled safety. What he did not see was how familiarity often blinded people to patterns they had become part of. How repetition could disguise risk until it was too late to ignore. Naomi's calm was not passive. It was anchored in foresight, shaped by years of watching systems correct themselves only when given the structure to do so. She had written those structures not as abstract ideals but as practical responses to specific behaviors. Language precise enough to withstand scrutiny and flexible enough to apply across jurisdictions. In those documents, moments like this were anticipated, not as personal conflicts but as indicators. Signals that prompted review rather than retaliation. As time stretched forward, an unspoken recalibration began to occur. The kind that happens when confidence meets information it cannot immediately categorize. A supervisor's attention sharpened. A question formed but was not yet asked. A pause introduced where there had once been certainty. Naomi noticed these shifts the way an analyst notices variables changing. Quietly, methodically, without commentary. She had seen how small acknowledgments led to larger examinations. How one flagged incident could cascade into broader assessments that no single individual could stop once initiated. Daniel remained focused on maintaining the surface narrative, unaware that the deeper narrative was already moving beyond him, carried by mechanisms he had never bothered to understand. The irony of that realization did not register on his face, but it resonated in the air. A subtle reminder that power grounded only in presence was fragile. Naomi's thoughts returned briefly to the purpose behind her work. The belief that institutions could be strengthened by confronting their weakest points. That fairness required structure, not sentiment. She did not feel vindicated or threatened, only resolved, because resolution was what sustained progress long after moments like this faded from memory. As the plaza settled into a new stillness, the balance continued its quiet shift, guided not by force or spectacle, but by a framework designed to ensure that actions, once taken, would be examined in full context, measured against standards that did not bend to familiarity or convenience. As the afternoon progressed, the subtle shift that had begun earlier continued to deepen, moving away from the visible space of the plaza and into places Naomi Ellis understood far better than concrete and open air. Inside nearby buildings, Conversations started that did not include raised voices or dramatic gestures. Only careful phrasing and deliberate questions that signaled attention had been drawn. Naomi sensed this not through any announcement, but through the familiar rhythm of delay. The moment when routine paused just long enough to allow evaluation. Officer Daniel Crawford noticed the pause as well, though to him it felt like uncertainty rather than process. An unexpected hesitation in a sequence he believed was predictable. He reassured himself with what had always worked before. That confidence projected stability. That authority asserted without doubt would settle the situation. Naomi remained composed, aware that situations like this often revealed more through restraint than reaction, and that the absence of urgency was sometimes the most effective catalyst for scrutiny. Her work had taught her that oversight rarely arrived loudly. It arrived methodically, beginning with a single inquiry and expanding outward through documentation and comparison. She had designed those mechanisms with intention, knowing that meaningful reform depended on consistency rather than spectacle. Around them, the world continued at a measured pace. The sound of a bus idling across the street, a digital clock on a nearby building displaying the steady march of minutes. All of it reinforcing the idea that time favored preparation. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, checking his surroundings, sensing a tension he could not quite place. And it unsettled him more than overt resistance ever had. He was accustomed to immediate responses, to visible compliance or vocal objection, and the absence of both left him without a reference point. Naomi, by contrast, recognized the pattern unfolding. The way initial certainty often gave way to review when faced with unanswered questions. She had seen how quickly narratives changed once context entered the discussion. How assumptions lost their footing when measured against established standards. Somewhere nearby, a report was being referenced. A name matched to a policy. A decision weighed against criteria that did not care about intent or tone. Only alignment. Naomi's expression did not change, because she understood that the work of accountability was rarely personal at the moment it began. It was systemic, built on the idea that actions carried consequences regardless of who witnessed them. Daniel continued to rely on familiarity, unaware that familiarity was often the first thing examined when patterns emerged. He had never considered how repetition could become evidence, how consistency without reflection could draw attention rather than avoid it. Naomi's focus remained steady, her thoughts returning to the principles that had guided her career, that fairness required structure and that integrity depended on the willingness to apply rules evenly. She had not written policies to target individuals, but to address behaviors, knowing that clarity removed the need for confrontation. As the atmosphere settled into a quieter tension, it became clear that the moment was no longer about presence or posture, but about records and review, about what would be examined once the scene dispersed. Naomi trusted that process, because she had helped shape it, and because she knew it was designed to function without her involvement once triggered. Daniel, still unaware of the full scope of what had begun, focused on concluding the immediate situation, believing resolution meant return to normal. What he did not realize was that normal had already shifted, recalibrated by a framework that operated beyond the reach of immediate authority. As the plaza gradually returned to its everyday rhythm, the balance continued to move quietly, guided by procedures that did not announce themselves, but progressed with certainty toward evaluation and consequence. By the time the plaza began to empty, the situation had shifted fully from a public moment into a procedural one. The kind that unfolded quietly behind secured doors and scheduled meetings rather than under open skies. Naomi Ellis felt the transition clearly, not as relief, but as recognition. Because this was the phase where intention mattered more than perception. She had spent years watching how incidents were absorbed into systems, how facts were separated from assumptions, and how consistency determined outcomes more than emotion ever could. Officer Daniel Crawford sensed the withdrawal of attention as a return to normal, a signal that the moment had passed without consequence, and he allowed himself a measure of reassurance rooted in past experience. He believed the absence of immediate response meant the absence of concern, not realizing that delayed review was often the most thorough kind. Naomi's demeanor remained unchanged as administrative steps quietly took shape around her. Phone calls placed, names logged, timestamps noted with precision. She understood how easily moments like this were dismissed when not properly framed, which was why her work had emphasized documentation over interpretation, facts over narrative. Somewhere within the structure she had helped design, criteria were being applied, not selectively, but systematically, comparing behavior against standards that left little room for explanation. Daniel moved through the remaining motions with habitual confidence, unaware that familiarity itself was now part of the evaluation, a pattern examined not for intention but for alignment. He had never questioned how often confidence went unchallenged, or how repetition could appear benign until measured over time. Naomi considered none of this personally, because she had learned that accountability was strongest when it operated independently of individual feelings. Her focus had always been on outcomes, on whether systems could correct themselves without requiring confrontation or escalation. As the afternoon stretched on, a subtle quiet settled in, the kind that followed resolution even when resolution had not yet been declared. Naomi remained grounded, aware that the next steps would unfold without her presence, guided by procedures that did not require explanation or approval. Daniel, preparing to move on to the next task, felt a faint unease he could not quite identify, a sense that the rhythm he trusted had been altered. Though he dismissed it as fatigue, he did not consider that oversight often began invisibly, with questions asked in neutral tones and answers cross-checked against records rather than recollections. Naomi reflected briefly on the purpose behind her work, the belief that integrity depended on systems willing to examine themselves, even when it was uncomfortable. She had written standards to endure moments like this, to operate without spectacle and without bias, ensuring that conduct was evaluated consistently regardless of who was involved. The plaza returned to its usual cadence, pedestrians resuming their paths, vehicles moving steadily through intersections governed by routine signals, all signs of normalcy restored. Yet beneath that surface, processes continued, unaffected by the return of quiet. Naomi trusted that momentum, knowing it was built to move forward steadily once initiated. Daniel, unaware of how far beyond the plaza the situation had traveled, focused on concluding his shift with the confidence of someone accustomed to predictable endings. What neither the setting nor the silence revealed was how thoroughly the moment had been recorded, contextualized, and placed within a framework designed to respond not with urgency, but with certainty. As daylight began to soften and shadows lengthened, the balance continued to shift, guided not by presence or posture, but by a system prepared to examine actions carefully and respond according to standards that did not waver. The days that followed unfolded with a precision Naomi Ellis had come to expect from systems built to observe rather than react, and she recognized the familiar cadence of review long before any formal notice surfaced. Emails were sent that asked neutral questions, calendars adjusted to accommodate briefings labeled routine, and documents retrieved from archives that rarely saw daylight unless something warranted closer attention. Naomi did not involve herself, because she understood that credibility depended on distance once a process began, and she trusted the framework to operate as intended. Officer Daniel Crawford, meanwhile, settled back into his schedule, the memory of the plaza already dulling as new tasks replaced old ones, reinforcing his belief that the absence of immediate consequence meant the absence of concern. He spoke casually with colleagues, recounting the incident as unremarkable, confident that his account aligned with expectations and norms he had rarely seen challenged. What he did not realize was how quietly his actions were being contextualized, compared against language embedded in standards he had never read closely, standards written to identify patterns rather than single moments. Naomi's authorship of those standards was not widely discussed, because effective policy rarely carried a signature visible to those it governed, and she preferred it that way. She had learned that anonymity protected the work from becoming personal and ensured that enforcement remained impartial. As files were reviewed and timelines reconstructed, each detail was measured against criteria designed to be unambiguous, removing discretion where discretion had too often led to inconsistency. Daniel continued to operate under the assumption that intent mattered most, unaware that modern accountability emphasized impact and alignment over interpretation. He had never considered how language he viewed as routine could be classified as deviation when examined without the cushion of familiarity. Naomi, aware that the process would surface its conclusions without her involvement, focused on her ongoing responsibilities, confident that the system would do what it was built to do. She reflected briefly on the years spent refining language to close loopholes that once allowed misconduct to be dismissed as misunderstanding, and she felt a quiet assurance knowing those revisions were now being applied. Meetings took place without fanfare, notes recorded with careful neutrality, and questions asked that required reference to policy rather than memory. Daniel sensed none of this directly, though he noticed subtle shifts. A delayed response here, a request for clarification there. Changes small enough to dismiss but frequent enough to unsettle him. He attributed the feeling to administrative backlog, never imagining that the very procedures he relied upon were now examining his conduct with the same rigor he expected others to face. Naomi understood that this stage often felt anticlimactic to observers, because accountability rarely arrived with confrontation. But she knew it was the most critical phase, where outcomes were determined quietly and irrevocably. She had designed sanctions to function as corrective instruments, not punishments, structured to address behavior systematically and restore trust through consistency. As the review progressed, the architecture of that system revealed itself through checklists and thresholds that did not bend under explanation. Daniel, increasingly aware that something had changed, began to replay the incident in his mind, searching for missteps he could articulate, unaware that the evaluation was not about a single choice but about alignment with expectations clearly defined long before. Naomi remained composed, her confidence rooted not in anticipation but in preparation, because she knew that when processes were followed correctly, results spoke for themselves. As internal deliberations advanced, the narrative surrounding the incident shifted from anecdote to assessment, and the plaza moment became one data point among many. The system moved forward steadily, guided by standards that required no interpretation and allowed no shortcuts, ensuring that whatever conclusion emerged would be grounded in policy rather than perception, and that the balance of accountability would be restored without spectacle or delay. The confirmation arrived not as an announcement but as a shift in tone, the kind that experienced professionals recognized immediately, and Naomi Ellis sensed it the moment her calendar updated without explanation. A meeting added that required no preparation and promised no discussion. She understood what that meant, that the process had reached a point where evidence spoke louder than narrative and conclusions no longer required interpretation. Officer Daniel Crawford felt the change differently. through interruptions that did not come with urgency but carried weight, requests phrased carefully, supervisors who listened more than they spoke, and an unfamiliar formality that replaced the casual exchanges he was accustomed to. He began to notice how often his name appeared in contexts he did not initiate. And for the first time, he wondered whether routine could become relevant. Naomi did not attend the meeting, because she had learned that distance preserved legitimacy once a framework was activated. And she trusted the system to proceed without her presence. Her confidence did not come from anticipation of outcome, but from faith in structure. The belief that clarity, once applied, removed the need for persuasion. Daniel, called in for what he assumed would be a brief clarification, entered a room that felt different from those he had known. Quieter, deliberate, focused on documentation rather than dialogue. Questions were asked that referenced policy language directly. Sections he had never memorized because he believed practice mattered more than text. He answered as he always had, explaining context, emphasizing intent, confident that explanation would suffice. What he did not realize was that the evaluation before him was not seeking justification, only alignment. And alignment did not depend on tone or familiarity. Naomi, continuing her work elsewhere, reflected briefly on how often accountability was misunderstood as confrontation, when in reality it functioned most effectively through comparison and consistency. She had written sanctions to operate automatically once thresholds were crossed, removing discretion at the point where bias most often entered. Those thresholds were now being applied, measured against records and timestamps that did not argue or negotiate. Daniel felt the weight of that structure when responses were noted rather than debated. And when the meeting concluded without reassurance or resolution, he left with a sense of incompleteness. Uncertain because certainty had always been his anchor. Naomi understood that feeling well, because she had observed it in others before. The moment when authority confronted a system that did not respond to confidence alone. As reviews progressed, decisions moved upward, through channels designed to ensure oversight without interference. And outcomes took shape guided by criteria rather than opinion. Daniel began to sense the implications. Not through accusation, but through the absence of dismissal. The realization that the matter was not being closed quietly. Naomi remained composed, her trust rooted in the principle that systems, when designed carefully, protected integrity by functioning independently of individual influence. She had not sought to dismantle authority, only to refine it, to ensure that the badge represented responsibility rather than assumption. When the determination was finalized, it arrived without ceremony, communicated through official channels that spoke plainly and left little room for reinterpretation. Daniel received it with a stillness he did not expect, reading language that referenced conduct in objective terms, linked directly to standards he now recognized too late. Naomi did not celebrate or reflect on the outcome publicly, because the result was not personal. It was procedural, the fulfillment of a framework intended to correct rather than condemn. As the process concluded, the quiet efficiency of the system stood in contrast to the confidence that had once defined the moment in the plaza, underscoring a truth Naomi had always known. That real power was not exercised in the instant, but built carefully to ensure that when it acted, it did so with precision and permanence. The realization did not arrive as a dramatic revelation but as a gradual alignment of facts that Daniel Crawford could no longer separate, and it began with a name he had seen before but never connected to consequence. In a quiet moment between obligations, he reviewed the documentation again, noticing how often the same author appeared across revisions and amendments. The language consistent, precise, unmistakably intentional. Naomi Ellis. The name carried no flourish, no title that announced power. Yet it threaded through the standards, now shaping his outcome with a clarity that unsettled him. He recalled the plaza, the calm presence, the stillness he had mistaken for passivity. And for the first time he understood that composure had not been uncertainty but confidence. Grounded in authorship, Naomi, continuing her work without interruption, remained unaware of the specific moment Daniel made the connection. Because she did not track reactions to outcomes she had designed to speak on their own. Her focus stayed on implementation and review, on ensuring that the framework continued to function evenly across cases without deviation. Daniel's understanding deepened as he traced the sanctions back through drafts, recognizing phrases he had dismissed as abstract during training, now applied with exactness. He realized that the standards had been written by someone who understood the dynamics he had relied upon, someone who anticipated the arguments he would make and structured the language to address them before they were spoken. The irony settled in quietly, heavy not because it was humiliating, but because it was undeniable. Naomi had never needed to announce her role, because the system carried her intent forward without requiring her presence. As Daniel reflected, he recognized how thoroughly the process had bypassed the assumptions he once trusted. How authority had shifted from immediate control to documented accountability without confrontation. Naomi's work had not targeted him personally, but it had anticipated behaviors like his with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The plaza scene returned to his mind with new clarity. The calm gaze, the patience, the absence of reaction, all signaling a confidence rooted in structure rather than circumstance. Naomi, informed through routine updates that the implementation phase was proceeding as expected, considered the broader implications, the quiet reassurance that standards could function as intended when insulated from influence. She had always believed that reform endured only when it removed the need for heroes and villains, focusing instead on consistency and clarity. Daniel's acknowledgement did not change the outcome, but it altered his perception of power, revealing how easily it shifted when grounded in preparation rather than presence. He understood then that the sanctions were not a response to a single moment, but the culmination of foresight applied patiently over time. Naomi's authorship represented that patience. The belief that change required more than reaction. It required architecture. As the connection became evident to others involved in the review, it did not prompt discussion or commentary, because the relevance lay in function, not identity. The system had operated as designed, and that was sufficient. Daniel absorbed the lesson without spectacle, recognizing that the authority he once assumed was permanent had always been conditional, dependent on alignment with principles he had underestimated. Naomi continued forward, her confidence unchanged, knowing that the most effective justice rarely announced itself, but revealed its strength through outcomes that spoke clearly and endured beyond the moment that set them in motion. The aftermath unfolded with a calm that contrasted sharply with the weight of its implications, and Naomi Ellis observed the broader effects with the same measured attention she brought to every phase of her work. Reports circulated that summarized outcomes without commentary, outlining adjustments and corrective measures framed as necessary recalibrations rather than reactions. She understood that lasting change often looked ordinary on paper, expressed through revised procedures and clarified expectations that quietly redirected behavior. Officer Daniel Crawford experienced the consequences as a narrowing of options rather than a sudden collapse. Responsibilities reassigned, expectations restated with specificity, and a path forward defined by compliance rather than assumption. He recognized that the system was not seeking to erase him, but to reshape conduct through structure. A realization that unsettled him precisely because it left no one to argue against. Naomi's framework had anticipated this phase. ensuring that responses were proportional and oriented toward restoration of trust rather than spectacle. Across departments, briefings emphasized consistency, reminding personnel that standards existed to protect integrity as much as accountability. Naomi listened to these developments through routine channels, noting how language she had refined now guided discussions she did not attend. She felt no personal satisfaction, only confirmation that the architecture functioned as intended when applied evenly. Daniel noticed how conversations changed around him. Less casual, more precise, colleagues referencing policy rather than habit. And he understood that the shift was not temporary. The Plaza incident had become a reference point, not because it was dramatic, but because it illustrated how quickly assumptions could be examined under clear standards. Naomi reflected on how many times such moments had passed unnoticed before frameworks like hers existed, and she felt a renewed commitment to ensuring that clarity remained central. The system continued to move forward, auditing processes, reinforcing training, and updating guidance to prevent ambiguity from taking root again. Daniel, adjusting to the new expectations, began to see how reliance on confidence alone had limited his perspective. And he found himself reading documents he had once ignored, searching for understanding rather than reassurance. Naomi's influence remained indirect, carried through language that shaped decisions without revealing its source. She preferred it that way, believing that policy should stand independent of personality to remain credible. As weeks passed, the effects rippled outward, subtle but persistent, shaping behavior through predictability rather than fear. Naomi observed how predictability fostered accountability. Because when rules were clear, outcomes were no longer surprising. Daniel came to understand that clarity removed the protection of ambiguity he had unconsciously relied upon. And while the realization was uncomfortable, it was also instructive. The institution, guided by the standards Naomi authored, demonstrated its capacity to self-correct without external pressure, reinforcing trust through transparency. Naomi considered this the true measure of success, not the outcome for any single individual, but the system's ability to function consistently over time. Daniel's role within it evolved, shaped by adherence rather than assumption. And he recognized that authority derived from alignment with principles rather than mere position. As the process reached its steady state, the quiet efficiency of the response stood as a testament to preparation, illustrating how foresight transformed moments of tension into opportunities for structural reinforcement. Naomi continued her work, confident that the changes underway would endure beyond the memory of the Plaza, because they were rooted in standards designed to outlast any single incident. The balance had shifted decisively, not through confrontation, but through the steady application of a framework built to ensure that accountability, once engaged, moved forward with clarity and permanence. Time settled the story into its final shape, not as an ending but as a recalibration. And Naomi Ellis observed the results with the same quiet attentiveness that had guided her from the beginning. The institution continued forward, operating under clarified standards that no longer relied on interpretation or habit. And she saw how predictability restored confidence more effectively than any statement ever could. The Plaza where everything had begun returned fully to routine. People passing through without awareness of the significance it once held. A reminder that the most enduring changes rarely left visible markers. Officer Daniel Crawford adapted to the revised expectations with a restraint he had not known before. Learning that alignment with principles required consistency rather than assertion, he recognized that authority now flowed through adherence to clearly defined boundaries. And while the shift challenged his assumptions, it also provided a structure he could no longer ignore. Naomi continued her work, reviewing implementation reports and refinement proposals, ensuring that the framework remained responsive without becoming reactive. She understood that systems needed maintenance, that clarity demanded ongoing attention to remain effective. The sanctions she had authored did not linger as punishments, but as guideposts, reinforcing the idea that accountability was not an endpoint but a standard to be upheld daily. Daniel came to see that lesson reflected in subtle ways, in how decisions were discussed, in how language shaped expectations, and in how predictability replaced discretion as the measure of fairness. He acknowledged privately that the calm he had once misread had been the strongest signal of all, an indication that the moment was never about control but about consequence. Naomi reflected on that as well, considering how often silence was mistaken for absence when it was actually preparation. She believed that justice functioned best when it did not need to announce itself, when outcomes spoke through consistency rather than spectacle. The broader environment absorbed the changes gradually. Training sessions adjusted, evaluations aligned, and oversight mechanisms reinforced without disruption. Naomi found reassurance in that steady progress, knowing that sustainable reform depended on integration rather than reaction. Daniel's perspective shifted as he recognized that the standards guiding his conduct were not arbitrary, but designed to protect both public trust and professional integrity. He realized that alignment offered stability, even when it demanded adjustment. Naomi never sought acknowledgement for her role, because the work had always been about creating conditions where fairness could operate independently of recognition. She measured success not by individual outcomes, but by the system's capacity to apply its principles evenly over time. As months passed, the plaza moment faded into institutional memory, preserved only in records and references that informed future decisions. Naomi continued to refine policy language, attentive to emerging patterns and committed to clarity, confident that preparation would always outpace reaction. Daniel carried forward the lesson, understanding that the most profound shift had occurred not in the moment of scrutiny, but in the realization that power rooted in structure endured longer than power asserted through presence. The balance that emerged was quiet but firm, anchored in standards that did not waver and processes that did not rush. In that steadiness, the story found its resolution, not through confrontation or declaration, but through the enduring strength of a framework built to ensure that accountability, once engaged, remained consistent, impartial, and lasting.